Hello, literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks, a podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us all improve our professional practice, knowledge, and confidence in teaching reading. Our host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and chief academic advisor at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an author, speaker, and a first-grade elementary reading teacher. Today's episode is part 4 of our 4-part mini-series and focuses on the last pages of the article, Ending the Reading Wars, Reading Acquisition from Novice to Expert by Castles, Rassel, and Nation. The focus is comprehension, a topic of critical importance and amazing complexity. Our hosts will explore the simple view of reading and the in-depth layers of skills and knowledge required to construct meaning from text. They'll also dive into implications for the classroom, with a focus on what teachers need to know and do to help learners build lasting comprehension skills. It's an eye-opening wrap-up for this in-depth review of a critical work in reading science. Let's get started.
Welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. I'm the host, Stacy Hurst, and I'm joined by Donnell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. And this is part 4 of a very long article that is very worthwhile. Lots to talk about, right, guys?
Yeah.
So if you put together all the hours we've talked about this one research article, I think, I don't know, I've gained a lot from it. So I hope you guys have, and I hope our listeners have. So today, for those of you who don't know, we are talking about Ending the Reading Wars, Reading Acquisition from Novice to Expert by Ann Castles, Kathleen Rassel, and Kate Nation. I'd like to thank them for writing this article and also for making it be available freely. So it's free access. Anybody can download it. And academics don't always have to do that. So I really appreciate that they did. So today we are going to talk about part 3. We talked about part 1, and the takeaway there, you can go back and listen to these episodes, but was about alphabetic skills and the writing system matters. Part 2 was all about print exposure and fluency, and the takeaway there was experience matters. And then today we're going to talk about reading comprehension. The authors of this article define the goal of reading as being able to understand a text, a task of immense complexity, which is what we will talk about today.
I'm excited to dig in. This is, as it kind of reiterates, this is so multifaceted, so complex. There's a million things that go into comprehension. We can sum it up by saying that and saying, there's like a whole bunch of things that could be going wrong when a student is struggling with comprehension. So,
absolutely. Donnell, anything to add?
I thought that was the biggest takeaway. So we might be referencing the simple view of reading, which gives us a nice framework. But then as we dive into this section, it's anything but simple, right? So I think that's the takeaway for me.
Yeah, I love that. So we're on pages 26 through the end of the article. And again, the title is Learning to Comprehend Text. And Donnell, just like you said, it starts out with a reference to the simple view of reading. And saying exactly what you said too, Lindsay, it requires a lot of complex processes to be able to comprehend text. And then starting on page 27, box 5, the simple view of reading, I thought that they really made that simple view very concise. One thing I underlined was that in that first part of the box, this simple framework has had influence both within and beyond the scientific community. Its clarity is appreciated by practitioners, and it has formed the basis of national reading reforms in England. When did you guys first learn about the simple view of reading?
I'm trying to think of like the first time. I don't know, it's been a few years.
I think for me, the first time somebody actually explained it well, not only referenced it, but then explained it well, would have been for me, Dr. Kilpatrick, and the work that he did. So that's about 2015.
Yeah. And, I asked that question because I think I'm not sure either. Lindsay, I'm kind of with you. Like, I don't remember. But this has been around since 1986. I am 100% certain I did not learn about it in my pre-service education. So it is a very important construct.
Yeah. And I should clarify, it would have been, the latest like 5-6 years ago, right? Because we know it was when my son was diagnosed with dyslexia. Then I started learning about all this. So I say I can't remember, not because I learned about it in college, because I know I didn't, but it was in the last 5 years.
Yeah. And it communicates in a simple way the complexity that is involved in reading. And we won't spend a ton of time going into it. I think these authors do a good job of concisely explaining it. They refer to it throughout this section, but I recommend, if you're not familiar with it, to research it and learn more. It is highly tested. When we say that science can be reliable, this is one thing we're talking about. It's been since 1986, and the nature of research is to try to prove things wrong. And so far, this has not been proven to be incorrect. So we start with, on page 28, they talk about comprehension in general. Is there anything in this section 3.1 that you guys highlighted or thought was worth mentioning?
Yes. I think in this section is one of the most beautiful explanations of reading comprehension. And you've probably heard this quoted before, and maybe you wondered where it came from. It's from this article. It says, reading comprehension is not a single entity that can be explained by a unified cognitive model. Instead, and here is like the big part, I think, it is the orchestrated product of a set of linguistic and cognitive processes operating on text and in interacting with background knowledge, features of the text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. So I love that part. It's the orchestrated product of a set of linguistic and cognitive processes. I mean, that just shows it's not one thing. There's so many things that go into comprehension.
Yeah. Orchestrated. I love that word too.
It's like poetic.
Yeah, it is. It is really pretty. I think Marianne Wolf comes to mind. She might be really happy with the definition and the way you described it, Lindsay. Donnell, anything that stood out to you here?
Yeah, so I think a word that we're going to hear over and over again is dynamic. I think that's really important because comprehension is very dynamic. And dynamic to me means lots of forces coming together, movement, building. And that is very much a part of comprehension.
And one thing we think of when we talk about comprehension, this term always comes up, background knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. What I really loved about this section, in fact, I don't know how many times I've read this article. I'd say at least 4. This has never stood out to me in the way it did this time. But they talk about the definition of background knowledge, and they say knowledge is broadly conceived and may include information such as the meanings of words, rules of grammar, knowledge of events and temporal relations, episodes, scenarios, emotions, and characters. So background knowledge is complex. There's a lot that goes into that.
Think about all the connections that are having to be made, right? And they've already talked about the fact that that's even on a time continuum. So even relevant to, is this current? Was it past? Is it pre? What can I anticipate? All of that is what we're talking about in the body of comprehension.
Yeah. And these sections, they talk about that. There are 3 things that comprehension depends on. Lindsay, you mentioned that it's multifaceted linguistic and cognitive processes, but they talk about the importance of children's knowledge, features of the text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. So in this first section, they do refer to the situation model, which is that active process as you're reading of creating a scenario in your mind of what is happening.
And here's where you can see that oral language, right, coming into play. I mean, that very first paragraph, it says, it also leans into, as we shall see, oral language sets a vital foundation for reading comprehension and its development, that oral storytelling, being exposed to narrative verbally.
Yeah. And that we're never not attending to comprehension if we're focusing on oral language, but even before somebody can read, right?
Yeah. And it talks about that. Just working on the oral language before they can even read is going to impact in a positive way their reading comprehension. So you can be working on these kind of things from the time they're very little through oral language.
And then something else I underlined, we talk about inference also when we talk about comprehension. Good evidence suggests that important aspects of reading comprehension and inference generation happen automatically, but readers can also deploy strategies to support comprehension. And I think that means once you have that foundation of language, they're also really clear to say that you need to be able to decode if we're talking about reading comprehension, right? But it does make it seem that if you have those two things in place, then they can happen automatically. So they talk also, again, flexibility is mentioned here because those strategies that they refer to need to be adapted according to the properties of the text and like its difficulty and the goals for reading. Anything else to add to that? I thought that was a good setup. And they do talk about it's a view from skilled reading that a lot of studies done refer to skilled readers. So we learn what goes into it. And then 3.2, factors influencing development of reading comprehension in children. What stood out to you guys in that section?
Well, what this section is going to do is it's going to divide up into three different parts, right? The importance of just the three constructs, it calls them, that underpin reading comprehension: knowledge, processes, and then cognitive resources. So are we going to take each one of those, or are we going to?
Yeah, we'll take each one. So in that first introductory section, anything else to mention there?
One thing that stood out to me is it says here, Perfetti in 1994 notes, there is room for lots of things to go wrong when comprehension fails.
I was going to say the same part.
Yeah.
Great and
minds.
They also, which would make sense, right? They also note that even these three things that they're going to talk about, they're intertwined. They're easy to identify separately, but hard to separate when you're trying to identify what's going wrong because they're so interactive with each other. Yeah, to your point, there is a lot that can go wrong. Okay, so you know what else I thought was interesting? That they do call out that not only is comprehension multifaceted, it is also complex developmentally. So they're going to refer to the reading systems framework here by Perfetti and Stafura in 2014. And if we haven't mentioned already, the resources and the references in this document are, you could probably earn an honorary doctorate just by studying all of those. There's some great things. So we start with knowledge, and they say knowledge is fundamental to comprehension. So they're talking about the types of knowledge. They're talking about orthographic, linguistic, and general knowledge. And they also highlight here, reading comprehension cannot happen without adequate levels of word reading skill. So they ask the question, what types of linguistic knowledge are important? And how would you guys answer that question? That sounds like a quiz question. It's not. But
Well, they start with vocabulary, right? And talking about how you need to know the meaning of the words, the majority of the words in the text that you're reading.
I thought that was interesting, Lindsay, too, when they make that point about vocabulary. And they just bring up the example of how well a child knows a word influences how efficiently it is processed. And this, in turn, influences the demands placed on general resources, such as working memory. So right there, that entanglement that, Stacey, you were talking about begins, right? Just of the load that I've got to carry based on the definition I have. If the definition is weak and shaky, I'm doing a lot more work to get to meaning for that word and to have it fit within the context of what's going on. Whereas a student who may have a better working knowledge of that word isn't having to work like that. And again, all of that's happening underneath the surface, right?
yeah, and they call this out later, but that's the lexical quality hypothesis, I think, which is also Perfetti. And then they talk about that vocabulary, rich vocabulary subsumes not only how well the meaning of those words are known, but how flexibly they can be used in a given context. And then they use a fun vocabulary word, polysemous, meaning that words can have more than one meaning. Interesting.
And then besides just knowing the words, it points out that children have to know how the words in the sentence are operating or working together. And, it talks about those cohesive ties, and like connecting, so he, she, what are those words referring to? What is it referring to? And tying it back into other parts of the text.
Yeah, I loved that because they also they call it multi-word utterances, but they talk about phrases like, by the way, And they also refer to idioms, of course, and figurative expressions, which are especially important to teach explicitly for students who are learning English. We have a lot of those fun things in our language.
And again, they make that connection between oral language and reading, right? So there's yet another reference there. Likewise, poor comprehenders have weaknesses in oral language that predate the onset of reading.
I like that it pointed out how written language is different from spoken language.
Yeah.
And so even in like young children's literature, there's, big differences with the formality and the tone. And it just shows how, yes, we need to be having these rich conversations with our students and children, but also reading to them from text because they're going to hear a whole different component of language that way.
Yeah. And that is really important because they do highlight again how important oral language is, even when we're talking about things like novels and films. And they compared movie scripts to the novels that they're based on. And there's no comparison. The vocabulary is richer and higher in a book than it is in those scripts. No substitute for reading the novel, they say. And the learning about the differences between spoken and written language starts early. And I think that's important to point out as well.
It's really interesting because it makes me think of an experience I had with one of my children. We were reading a book that was well above his reading level. It's my son who struggled with reading. And it was a book well above most of the readers in my household, but we chose to read it because of the subject matter, and it's a classic. And it was interesting because towards the end of the novel, he's the only one who's still with me, right? It's over summer reading, and it was kind of by choice, air quotes. And so some had already decided to flee the room, but he stayed and hung in there to the bitter end. But what's interesting is we had watched the black and white version of this book, and the nuance of the conversation in the courtroom is lost in the movie. I mean, even though they do a fine job, I love all the actors that were in the film, it was very good, but you lose a lot of the nuance that happens that you can get out of the book. So as I'm reading the book to my son, we get to that courtroom drama, and I was amazed at being able to ask him just a question about, why do you think everybody in the room wants him to be guilty? And my son, bam, gives the right answer right off the bat. And he had caught up all of that information that he was receiving through that dialogue exchange. And I thought that was really interesting, which would have been, as I say, lost having watched a very good movie version, but very different.
Yeah. And imagine, Donnell, if you were only exposing him to books he could actually decode. Look at what he's missing out on that he's totally capable of comprehending and discussing. This is why we have multiple text experiences in our classrooms.
The authors are very clear. They call out that they're talking about how reading comprehension typically develops, but they frequently mention things about poor comprehenders. And one of them, they say they have weaknesses in oral language that predate the onset of reading. So these are something we can absolutely attend to and keep track of. So when you're doing a read aloud with your child or your students, pay attention, like you did, Donnell, to how your student is processing that information. A really important outcome they also mention is background knowledge, and how adding that to long-term memory is only going to help in the future when situation models vary, right? I don't know if any of you appreciated this, but I read that paragraph that they're quoting Willingham that used in his book. And it goes like this. I just, as a listener, just read and see what you can comprehend based on your background knowledge. Carol Harris was a problem child from birth. She was wild, stubborn, and violent. By the time Carol turned 8, she was still unmanageable. Her parents were very concerned about her mental health. There was no good institution for her problem in her state. Her parents finally decided to take some action, and they hired a private teacher. Now, as I read this, I was creating a situation model in my head, but based on my background knowledge, I made a connection. What were you guys thinking as you read this? Obviously, it's Helen Keller, but we were able to come to that conclusion. That's an inference, right? Because they actually stated he did this on purpose. He said the wrong name. Based on the background knowledge that we have, we not only were putting together, okay, they're going to get help for this child, and why are they so unmanageable? Maybe the questions that come up, but we were able to connect, oh, they're talking about Helen Keller, or at best saying this sounds like Helen Keller, right? Making those connections across text. So background knowledge and long-term memory helps comprehend future texts.
And even if you're not making the connection to Helen Keller per se, if you're not really familiar and that didn't resonate with you, you could be creating your own image of. Maybe there's something in the past that reminded you of something. Again, that's rich and deep, being able to connect it to something else. And then when it's revealed, oh, it's Helen Keller, then it depends on, oh, I've heard that story. It was read to me. And then another connection is made, which is really interesting. So all of that, so rich to that text.
And I know we've talked about this before, but when I taught first grade, and I learned this in my balanced literacy instruction. So again, it might have been the episode we were talking about not overturning the boat, but really teaching explicitly those connections between text to self, text to text, and text to world early on will help facilitate that kind of thinking. Lindsay.
Well, it just said in there, it just more and more, it reminds me how important it is for students to have access to audiobooks with all of this, especially those who are struggling or can't read yet. It says poor readers tend to have less background knowledge and are less likely to draw on it as they read. And it's this whole Matthew effect. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer because they're not able to read as much, then they learn less through text, which is why we also need to give them the opportunity to, do read aloud text with them, let them listen to audiobooks, help them through complex texts, all in addition to if they still need those decodable texts.
Great points. And you know what they do say, obviously, that background knowledge needs to be activated while we're reading. And that moves us into the next section where we're talking about processing cognitively what happens during the course of reading. And in this section, they just focus on 3. They said several processes are engaged as people read, but they're going to focus on meaning activation, inference generation, and comprehension monitoring. What did you guys think about those? Anything to note?
It said poor comprehenders find it difficult to integrate ideas across a text and are less skilled at answering questions that require an inference to be made. It's like you kind of realize, oh yeah, that is kind of hard if that doesn't happen naturally for you. And also, side note, did any of you think about all this stuff while you were reading it? As I'm trying to comprehend this difficult research article, I was thinking all these, I'm having to integrate ideas across all these different paragraphs that they're telling me. I couldn't stop thinking about that.
Actually, I love that you brought that up. In several places, I wrote in my notes, relate to professional learning, because we've talked about this frequently on this podcast especially for those people who are newer to learning about the constructs in the science of reading. Just keep learning, right? You're going to build a bigger and bigger bank of background knowledge. And pretty soon the cognitive demands on a text like this are fewer and fewer, right? Because you already have that to draw from.
And, I think it's interesting because I say it over and over again. We'll probably say it in many different ways. Comprehension is fundamentally about making inferences. That was really just one sentence to say it clearly. Comprehension is fundamentally about making inferences. And this leads me to, and I think about this all the time, making sure we're having rich conversations with students before asking them to do anything, which I think is really something we all ought to get down and have down, is if I want them to read, what do they know about what I want them to read? And what understanding do they have? And what should I provide? Right. So that I think about that all the time when I'm working with students is what should they have at hand in order to get a rich experience out of this? And the same with writing. I wouldn't have a student sit down and cold write, although we do that to students all the time. But really, there should be rich conversation around what should happen with this writing project or task that I'm having you do. And right here, that just says it for me so well. Comprehension is fundamentally about making inferences.
Yeah, that was a true or false question on one of the quizzes for my students, by the way. They also mentioned, which I think is important, the ability to kind of prune information that isn't essential. Yeah. And that can be related to inference. It can interfere if you don't do that. It can interfere with inferring. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to question somebody who didn't really understand what they read. I know my first graders would do this. And they call out just a random thing, a totally random, unessential thing to the meaning of what they read. They weren't able to prune that out of their monitoring as they were monitoring their comprehension. So that I think is interesting as well. And then Donnell, to your point, inference generation, they say is a predictor of reading comprehension. So we can't overlook it for sure.
Educators, families, policymakers, and our communities at large are all focused on coming together to help all children develop reading proficiency. That's why you'll want to learn more about the new Reading Horizons Discovery. It's the evidence-based foundational literacy program educators asked for and educators helped create. With innovative technology to support teachers and students, a complete collection of decodable books, a digital sound wall, real-time coaching, and more, Reading Horizons Discovery gives you everything you need to help all K-3 students become proficient readers. So, take off with a trusted science of reading aligned approach. Stay on top of student progress and individual needs with a tech-enabled tool and streamlined student data. And then take action to transform reading challenges into literacy success. Go to readinghorizons.com/product guide to download a complete program overview today.
I thought it was really interesting moving into at last skill, because they're also interrelated, that another skill that has been implicated in reading comprehension is comprehension monitoring. And that's along with your pruning, Stacey, that pruning idea is that comprehension monitoring. What do I know so far? Being able to take a quick survey of what you understand. Boy, is that important in reading.
Yeah. And realizing when you don't understand.
Yes.
I mean, we do that, right? We're like, wait, I just read that whole page. I have no idea what I just read. Go back and reread. But you're going to have some students that just keep reading and don't really consciously go, oh, wait a second, I don't know what I'm reading about. I should go back and really think about that.
Or to be able to identify where it broke down, right?
Yeah.
We learned about the word anaphor when we were talking about pronouns referring to the person who was named before. And I actually read over that. The first time I heard that word, I got a general idea of what it meant. I knew what it was referring to, but I looked it up, ana meaning before and for meaning something that bears. So it's something that bears what the meaning before, right? So when I realized, wait, I'm not understanding this on the level that I probably need to, then I knew what to do. That was a vocabulary strategy. Morphology specifically, I could figure it out. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's all important. They do call out to plausibility and a standard of coherence. When you're monitoring your comprehension, you need to be able to understand that. So I made a note here that is critical even with decodable text. Mm-hmm. And I would say, be sure, I know decodable text is a kind of a thing, right? It's really hard to write. I know I've written it before, but we need to make sure that our syntax and the situation model that are being presented to children makes sense to them.
And we need to make on the other side, as the students read it, where we attend to meaning. This is not our big comprehension focus of the decodable text, but you can still ask, text-dependent questions at the end to make sure they understood what was happening, or have them retell the story to make sure they're comprehending it.
You can also really extend it, right? I remember one situation where I was actually modeling a lesson, and it was in a small group. They just read decodable text, and we had been talking about synonyms. So we took a very decodable word like big, and we created a lot of synonyms. We didn't create them. We named them. We're not making up our own language here. But we were able, at least verbally, to talk about ginormous and, talk about the range of those words related to it. So decodable text needs to also make sense. That's really important. And they also mention a reason why that is important, because early on in a student's reading development, kindergarten through second grade especially, the ability to decode words makes the biggest difference for comprehension. But they still need to be able to make sense of what they're reading, obviously. But then going forward, vocabulary and background knowledge and all these things we're talking about are assuming they can decode the words accurately. Those are the things that interfere with comprehension. So we're always attending to those in one way or another. And then the next section we're going to talk about are those general cognitive resources. So they're talking about working memory here. And Donnell, I know that you have been recently kind of learning and expressing a lot more about this. Anything in this section that made you really want to emphasize it?
I don't think we spend enough time really going over how hard the student is working and how all of that plays into the ability to pull out information, right, that you may have available to you. I think this is a really important and underserved area. And we've talked about that before. Obviously, we've had conversations about it. And so the more load that I'm carrying, the more difficult it is for me to be able to reach in and access, right, those things that maybe I have learned and maybe it is in there, but it's difficult for me to have that available to me because of how hard I'm working with everything else. And that to me sometimes has really helped teachers to understand, oh, that's why we examine all of the pieces to make sure the student really does have this down with automaticity, right? And there's a level of fluency there. Because if I'm really struggling at any of those levels, it can impact my ability to have access to, as you say, this memory, right? I thought it was interesting too. They talk about regulation even in the ability to be able to access memory.
I thought that was really interesting because, okay, yes, executive functioning skills, my son, that's a huge deficit, especially with working memory. And so their definition of working memory, I really appreciate it. And I feel like it was kind of different than maybe how I first thought of it. And Donnell, I think it is because it includes that regulation piece. And honestly, when I first read their little definition, I just started laughing because I'm like, what is this even talking about? Like, this is a great example of like all these words. And you're like, what? I can't comprehend this. And then I just go back and read it again. And I'm like, no, I understand this. And oh yeah, that is a great definition. So let me read it. It's working memory can be defined as the mechanisms or processes involved in the control, regulation, and active maintenance of task-relevant information in the service of complex cognition. I mean, there's a lot there, but I don't know. To me, I hadn't heard a definition like that for working memory.
Thought it was interesting. And they kind of make reference to this. They do bring it up later, citing the research. And there was a meta-analysis, I believe, on this too, that working memory training has not actually showed gains.
Right. And it talks about that in the implication.
But that's where I think that lexical quality comes in. You can really help facilitate getting that in long-term memory if you're really examining that or creating word recognition, high quality lexical information about words. So, okay, my favorite part is to talk about the implications for the classroom. So is there anything before that we need to mention?
No, I think there's just a little bit of humor in this sometimes where they're like, well, it's obvious. Comprehension will suffer if a child cannot read the words in a text, right? Like, we know that.
Yeah, especially given the title of this, which is about reading wars. And that's constantly a battle that is mentioned, as we've brought up before. I also like how they are very specific in saying in skilled readers, the correlation between listening comprehension and reading comprehension is almost perfect. So again, anytime we spend focusing on comprehension, whether it's verbal or with text, is well worth it.
And Stacey, I don't know if you're going to mention it or not, but assessing reading comprehension, they just have a quick section there. And I love that they acknowledge how difficult it is to really accurately measure comprehension, right? There are different ones that we use and things, but because of the complexity, just in our discussion here about what goes into comprehension, how difficult it is to measure, really.
Yeah. And they bring that up in the next section when they talk about implications for the classroom. One of the first things they say is, the appreciation that reading comprehension is a complex construct leads quickly to the realization that improving reading comprehension is unlikely to be simple.
I liked the part it says, it is not talking about an assessment, talking about comprehension. It is not a single entity that can be cleanly and reliably captured by a gold standard test. I mean, how many of us want to go, yes, can I go show this to someone at the district? Or can I show this to my, Oh.
Yeah. And you know what? I think I don't want to give any, we should have Stephanie Stoller on here. I'm talking about Acadiant specifically, because they added that measure, right? Where they're supposed to be measuring comprehension. But it explains why that is such a hard thing to measure and that it's going to be hard, especially in a screener like that, to really adequately measure what you need to know. But my history of learning about that test is limited, but I do remember that the creators saying they had a hard time with that particular measure. One thing I want to call out is that at the bottom of page 34 and going on to 35, the authors reference some literature that has been expertly synthesized into accessible accounts and practical guides. And then they list, including recent books by, and they list those. I circled those in the references. I'm going to be looking them up and saving money to order them because I'm curious to see what they're recommending there. But I just thought I'd mention that in case any of you are interested in doing that as well. And then they do list some resources in a table. Box 7 on page 39, they list a whole bunch of books. And I think that's probably for reading development in general, but lots of great things listed there. So yeah, Lindsay, you talked about assessing reading comprehension.
Then it goes into like some strategy instruction, right? And so it talks about how the National Reading Panel recommended reciprocal teaching, which I'm a fan of reciprocal teaching. I have done that. It's kind of a scaffolded discussion technique, and the students are taught 4 main strategies. So it's clarifying, summarizing, predicting, and question generating. So they're generating the questions from the text, which is really great because they've got to understand the answer in order to come up with the question. And so I like that it talked about that. And then that it also went into what Daniel Willingham has found about, that there's not a lot of evidence that we need to spend tons of time on this strategy instruction. I think that's really interesting. Every time I read his stuff, it's just interesting to me that, there's good effects for less time spent on those strategy instructions.
Yeah. And with reciprocal teaching, I think the main thing there is what they call out as increasing the level of engagement with the text, active engagement with text as they're reading. We leaned into that hard in my district, even 15 years ago, and saw that students got a lot out of that kind of instruction. Donnell.
So I think there are some takeaways that I'm paying attention to, and that is, with all of this great information, know your students. And what's the best way to know your student than to listen to and spend time hearing your student read and what their responses are to that, right? So that was really important. I think that message received. And likewise, even though we have strategies and they're excellent, and to be thinking about them, nothing replaces being in text, right? Having experiences with text. So I think we're hearing those things as well.
Yeah, he said Willingham suggested just 5 or 6 sessions for that explicit strategy instruction. And he did say larger effects for the upper grades, right?
Yeah. They need to know when to apply those strategies as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bigger conversation, but in education, we frequently get the word skill and strategy confused, right? So I think that's important to know too. I was really encouraged by that. The explicit strategy instruction is effective and it can be short.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. And it works best when word reading fluency is in place when you're talking about reading strategies. They also say here too, no amount of strategy instruction can bring about successful comprehension if the text cannot be understood because of limitations in the knowledge or difficulties with activating knowledge in the service of comprehension. So you need to comprehend enough to get information out of it.
Right. So
and to be able to recognize if you don't comprehend it, right? Like we talked about before.
That vocabulary and knowledge, which we go into vocabulary in the next section.
Yeah. And they talk about how vocabulary instruction specifically led to significant improvements and on custom-made comprehension passages containing those taught words, right? So they really talk about vocabulary instruction. Donnell, I think you mentioned it before too, is really effective when it's related to the text. When it's text-centric, they're going to be more likely to be able to transfer that, but the real effects are seen within the context of a text.
And the part I thought was so exciting, it's talking about, teaching those vocabulary words before they read the text and how much the number of minutes per word that's necessary. And guess what? Less than one minute per word in some studies. So they were saying even just a brief little opportunity to introduce the word before you read the text is helpful. And that's nice as teachers when we have like a gazillion things that we have to teach every day.
Yeah. I think often of Anita Archer, she's very, not only her perky pace, but the way that she addresses vocabulary is very efficient and quick. And so if you're a teacher and you're tempted to cut that out because you don't have time, it takes less than a minute and the return on the investment is invaluable.
Yeah. If you don't have time to do the big thing on a word, just at least do that quick little thing that's going to help them comprehend the text that you're about to read.
Yeah. Whenever I think of vocabulary, I always think use it or lose it. That's one of those things. You're using it. It's got to be in there somewhere relating to something in order to hang on to it, right? So utility quickly.
And then again, we're calling out in this article, they call out that direct vocabulary instruction alone is inefficient. We know through research that once you can read, the best way to improve your vocabulary is through reading. But they also mention that they go back to, again, knowing that word on many levels, that lexical quality, but then being able to be flexible with the meanings of the words depending on the situation.
So the next part.
Oh, yeah. One thing I also wanted to mention was that focusing on specific types of words, like those that are not yet known, but need to be known to comprehend a variety of texts. So those are tier 2 vocabulary words, right? And so, when we're choosing words for our instruction, that's a good place to focus. The other thing I thought was interesting there, the way they address Latin roots. And they said, they cited some research saying that students were able to learn after fairly minimal instruction. So even with that, they get the concept and like a little goes a long way, right?
And again, usage, right? Once you start using it, absolutely.
Good point. Okay, so now let's talk about inferences. Inference instruction was shown to benefit reading comprehension. Alongside this general effect, performance on inferential aspects of comprehension also improved. So transfer to that literal comprehension was lower when we're talking about inferences. But again, you don't need a lot of time. Benefits seem to follow quickly, and more practice was not associated with greater gains. They also talk about the use of graphic organizers, which helps students in that area as well, especially with background knowledge and helping them to make connections between ideas in a text. Anything else that stood out to you guys in that section?
I thought it was interesting that they're acknowledged that we still need a lot of research in this area to see what is most effective in terms of inference. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I like that they do that throughout, that they say we need future research here. I know after teaching first grade, developmentally, first graders are very literal thinkers. So you do have to scaffold their inference making abilities. And there are many ways to do that. I think we've talked about that in previous episodes. So you may want to revisit those conversations. But strategies are out there, ways to present that to students. Anything to mention about inference instruction? Okay, now we're on to working memory again. We're talking this time about how it's applicable in the classroom in our instruction. So I actually put a frowny face in the notes here because it says, if working memory resources limit comprehension, is it possible to improve reading comprehension by strengthening working memory? ? The answer to this question seems to be no.
And you need to watch out because there's a lot of kind of like snake oil things out there where they're like, oh, we're going to do these little, work on this memory, whatever brain thing program. It's going to improve their memory. But guess what? Maybe they'll do better at that certain task, but that does not transfer over to their reading. It's not going to help their reading.
Yeah, I think that's important. I know when my parents were getting help for my little brother, they had him in some interesting types of therapy that were making claims to increase things like working memory.
And right now we just don't have the evidence for that. And I like that it says that very clearly. And it says current working memory training programs do not improve reading comprehension. I just remember being really saddened by when my son, his working memory was off the charts. It was so low. And I'm like, what can I do to help this? And it just seemed like nothing. That's just how it is. Do you know what I mean? That's just it can be discouraging. And we never we never worked on working memory, but we worked on all these other things. We worked on reading, and we worked on understanding the text. And guess what? His working memory did improve.
It's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing, Donnell.
So that's where the instructional practices that you find in that explicit systematic teaching, right, that lend themselves to breaking down to taking it down to the basics, spending time really working on to mastery, being able to work on something to mastery. And then I take a lot of those same practices and apply them to other aspects of a student's learning who has the same challenges. Break things down. How many times have we heard this, right? With students who may be in ADHD impacting working memory. Break things down into smaller units. Make sure you have a system for things. Keep it the same day to day so you don't have to think about what's coming, right? So a lot of the practices that you find are very good in teaching skills can be very useful for students in other aspects of their learning.
And they do give us hope. They don't just leave us with, sorry, working memory can improve. Instead, they say instruction should focus on, and we've heard this before, even multiple times in this episode, on developing lexical quality at the word level. And this is my favorite word, and optimizing children's knowledge and skills so that limited working memory resources can be used to the best effect. So I like the word optimize there. That lexical quality is really important. You might need to do a whole episode on that. Okay. And then you guys were on page 38, the reading comprehension in the classroom, the summary. I have a few notes here, but I'd like to hear what you guys noted.
More evidence is needed to identify which strategies should be taught when and for how long. That's a good thing to underline. While strategy instruction might be quick, the acquisition of knowledge is gradual and continuous. This can be assisted by direct teaching and using structured materials that support the curriculum. Ultimately, however, it relies on rich input, much of which will come from reading experience itself.
And I just highlighted kind of the part right before that, again, talking about that oral language, and that even before children can read, we can give interventions that target oral language, and it will lead to improvements in reading comprehension. Again, especially as a lower grade teacher, I think that's neat that we can, be attending to that.
And then this part I underlined too. While strategy instruction might be quick, the acquisition of knowledge is gradual and continuous. It made me think of even something like Scarborough's reading rope, and Hollis Scarborough herself said she could do it all over again. She'd make sure at the bottom it said these processes happen over time. This is another section that I called out professional learning, because as we build information and knowledge, all of that happens over time. You can't learn everything there is to learn about the science of reading, even in one school year, right? And not only learning, but learning how to apply it, which again is just one thing that I love the most about this article and about other texts. I think of Christopher Such's book and Lindsay, your book, where it goes over the science and then talks directly about how to apply it. And you can read those books, but you're going to get the most out of it if you're applying those things in your own instruction, and your knowledge is going to even grow faster and more solid that way too. So that rich input and experience, and they call that out for readers too, because we can affect that by direct teaching and using those, like you said, Donnell, those materials that support the curriculum. Teaching children to read and then providing opportunities for varied, extensive, and successful reading experience is fundamental. And they end with that section by saying, we repeat that message here. So I think that's very important to them. Okay, in the conclusion of the text, anything you guys want to call out there? I feel like they gave a good overview of the whole paper.
They just wrap it up quickly. It's a couple of paragraphs because boy, have they laid it out well.
Yeah. And I like that it kind of said in relation to teaching that the teacher training programs are doing future educators a huge disservice if they don't equip them with the knowledge of our writing system and the broader language system it represents, which is kind of what they're talking all about in this great article.
And they end by saying, in our view, it would be valuable to reclaim a term such as balanced instruction. I know I reacted to that when I first read it because of the reading wars, right? But they say, and recast it in a more nuanced way that is informed by a deep understanding of how reading develops, The guiding principle here would be that although there are many different aspects of reading that must be learned, this does not mean that instructional time should be devoted equally to all of them at all points in reading acquisition. They're talking about that essential combination of instruction at critical times in development.
I love how it said deepening our knowledge. And that's what we're doing. And that's, if you've been listening to this whole series on this article and reading along the article with us, or even just skimming it a little bit and reading parts, that's what you're doing. You're deepening your knowledge, which is going to be so beneficial for your students.
I'm just going to say, when we do deepen our knowledge, then within our communities, our learning communities as educators, we can have better conversations as well and help each other. So we're elevating our profession and our skill by engaging in this kind of dialogue and this kind of background when we ourselves are reading.
Which is kind of the whole point of even our podcast, right? Our podcast and our life's work and working with readers. I think that's great. So the authors started on page 8 by saying our aim, they point that out right at the very beginning, is to provide our readers with the scientific background they need. So we're talking about that depth of knowledge to promote best practices in the classroom. Why? To minimize the proportion of children who struggle with reading as a result of non-optimal teaching, or, air quotes, instructional casualties. And they're quoting Readline there. And then they end, their final sentence says, "It is our hope that this review will contribute to ending these wars so that a further examination of the status of this debate 15 years hence will not be required." I'm hopeful that will be the case. How about you guys?
Please, can we stop fighting, and can we, have good dialogue around evidence-based, instruction? We can have little debates within. That's fine. But let's stop with saying, oh, it's not just about words, or doing these straw man arguments where we're like, we know, I just wish we could rise above all that.
Yeah. And think about where each of us will be in 15 years in our career. Listener, think about where you will be. Oh man, I hope we're not having these debates still. And I think of the words optimize, right? Let's optimize instruction. Let's optimize our learning, and let's optimize our students' ability to read and comprehend. So with that, we will end this series. As ever, looking forward to hearing your input as you read this. Thank you for listening along, and we will see you on the next episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. We invite you to join the Science of Reading Collective, our free community and resource hub, so you can stay current with new ideas, free webinars, resources, and more. And be sure to visit Literacy Talks online for resources, access to every season's episodes, and more at readinghorizons.com/literacy talks. It's an exciting time to teach reading and ensure your students reach grade level proficiency this school year. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.